The poll window is like above, is covering the.
Oh, you can see the poll window?
Yes, now I can.
It's gone now, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, cool. Um, One other warning is that I rediscovered a love of animations in slides, so there'll be lots of animation in this slide deck. Okay, first, quick list of acronyms. There are a bunch of acronyms you don't need to care about. They're defined here if you want to know what they are, but they just kind of randomly ended up in the presentation. The ones that matter are CAN, which is what we're talking about, which stands for Controller Area Network, and it's a communications protocol. And a communication protocol, all that means is just a bunch of rules about hardware and software that some group of people came up with to complete some task of sending information from one thing to another thing. In our case, those things that we're sending information between are PCBs that have microcontrollers on them. PCB sensor printed circuit board. They're those little like green or purple or red flat things that we put our electrical components on. And then ID, this is a very common acronym, but I wanted to be thorough. So you probably know ID stands for identifier, similar to like an ID that you would have for school, for example. All right, so the learning objectives of this presentation are, I want to know where do we use CAN on the car to give you some formula context. We're gonna learn why is CAN so cool. So that's mostly gonna be general information about CAN, and I think CAN is really, really dope. So yeah, hopefully I can get you all as excited about it as I am. And there'll be some formula specific information in that section, but it'll largely just be kind of abstract knowledge about the CAN bus protocol. And then lastly, to give you some more like very formula, or like some more information on like what you can actually do with this information, we'll talk about how to figure out how fast a CAN bus needs to go. And for example, our CAN bus operates at 500 kilohertz, which means it sends one bit of information, so a 0 or 1, every 1/500,000th of a second. So in 1 second, it'll send 500,000 bits of information, or is able to do that. Cool. And I'm going to look to the side a couple times because I have some notes written down here because I can't see the presenter view when I'm sharing screen. I couldn't figure out how to do that. So anyways. All right. So where do we use CAN? Sorry, I'm going to turn off my computer audio for you guys right now because I don't want you to hear me getting emails. So where do we use CAN? In this section, all we're going to talk about is we're going to look at the CAN bus diagram. I want to make a quick shout out to someone who's done a lot of work for our CAN, the way we use CAN on the car, but who cannot be here because he is sleeping. That's Peter. And so here's a cute picture of Peter sleeping because he's sleeping right now in Sweden. All right, this is the CAN bus diagram. It's not important that you know exactly what all the parts of this are. Don't worry about the difference between what a stub or a branch is and what the main CAN bus is. The point is the red and green lines are the wires that go between our enclosures that make up the CAN bus. And so like we're communicating information along those wires. So like, for example, the brake light board, and this is an example we're going to talk about a few times in the presentation, the brake light board is sensing whether or not there's brake pressure to see if the brake's being pressed. And when it sees that the brake's being pressed, it'll send some message along this CAN bus saying the brake's being pressed. The dashboard will get that information. And so that way, when we do the startup sequence where you have to push on the brake and then push the start button, the dashboard has that information, even though the dashboard is not directly sensing the brake pressure. So it's a way our boards kind of tell each other what's going on in the car. Cool. So that's it for this section. Oh, sorry. One thing I forgot to mention, we also use CAN inside the enclosure. So like, even though the throttle and the dashboard are in the same enclosure here, which is the dashboard enclosure, they can still communicate on the CAN bus with each other. So we use it inside enclosures, we use it outside enclosures. It's the main way our PCBs communicate with each other. So that's all for this section. The answer to where we use CAN is all over, inside and outside enclosures. It's a primary way our PCBs communicate with each other. A bonus piece of information is that our CAN bus could be up to 100 meters long, which is super long. And I know that's mind-blowing to me. I know it might be mind-blowing to someone else, which is Anil. Sorry, I just decided to put some stupid pictures in this slideshow. All right. So I had a poll associated with this, but the poll is just too basic. I think it just says, where do we use CAN? And the answer is both inside and outside of enclosures. It's the main way our PCBs communicate with each other. So I think you guys all got that. I'm going to go ahead and skip that poll. One note is that this bus length, maximum bus length, depends on your bus speed. So this is particular for the fact that we run at 500 kilohertz. If you ran faster or slower, the slower you run, the longer your bus can be. The faster you run, the shorter your bus can be. So that's just one little tidbit of information for you if you're interested. Okay. Cool. So now we're going to start talking about why is CAN so cool. We're going to cover the fact that CAN is a differential signal. We're going to talk about how it has a redundancy check, which helps us reduce the likelihood that there's an error in a message that gets sent. And we're going to talk about bus arbitration, which you might have heard the analogy that Audi uses a lot of time, which like CAN is like a bunch of people shouting at the same time. And so bus arbitration is how you decide who gets to shout, and you basically decide who's the most important person shouting, and everyone else gets quiet, and then that person goes, and then the next most important goes on and on and on. And one thing we're going to cover is the concept of termination resistors. And so we'll get more into that later on in this section. All right. So a quick disclaimer is that I use the colors green and yellow for CAN here because CAN is 2 wires. We actually use black and white on the car. If we did use green and yellow, which we used to do, the protocol would be to have yellow be the high one and green be the low one. And I realized that very late in the process, and it was not worth my time to go back and update the diagrams. It doesn't actually matter, but that's just the reality. So green is going to be the higher voltage between the 2 CAN wires for us. Okay. So what is the difference between a differential and single-ended signal? So a single-ended signal is just one wire, like one voltage you're measuring, and that voltage can be high or low compared to some other reference. And don't worry if you don't fully understand that, just think single-ended, 1 wire. Differential, 2 wires. And you're measuring the difference in voltage between those 2 wires. And those wires are going to be right next to each other everywhere they go. So on the car, we run those wires right next to each other. And the reason is, if we have some kind of external interference, which is represented by these lightning bolts, at a particular point in time, that can actually change the voltage of the wires. And so for a single-ended system, because you're just looking at that one wire compared to some other reference, you can actually get a different bit. You can change a bit from a 0 to a 1 with that interference because it causes some distortion in your signal. Whereas with a differential signal, it's much more robust to that kind of noise because the difference between the 2 voltages stays the same at any point because they're experiencing the same interference because they're right next to each other all the time. And that interference can come from a lot of different sources. I'm not going to get into that because I don't want it to become confusing, but that's the idea behind having a differential signal. You add a second wire, you run them right next to each other, you measure the difference. It's more robust to external interference. Cool. Yep. All right. So now let's start talking about what the redundancy check is. Oh, sorry. Just one thing to make sure it's 100% clear. CAN is a differential signal. And so this is one of the really cool parts about CAN is that it's more robust to this kind of external interference and because the difference stays the same. All right. So talking about the redundancy check. So what happens when you send a CAN message is you got a couple different parts. One is the address, which we'll talk a lot more about later, but this says like who is sending the message. So when I'm shouting, I'm like saying, hey, Lucky wants to shout. Here's my message that I'm going to shout. And that message is the data. And then afterwards, I'm going to tell you some indication of what I was supposed to send. And then when you receive that, like when the person or whatever, the board that's receiving that message, oh shoot, sorry. It's going to then take what it got, like the address and the data bits, put it through some equation, and then it's also going to get this redundancy check, and it's going to compare what it got to what it was supposed to get. And I'm going to go through this in a lot of detail in the next slide, so I'm kind of like breezing through right now. And that's how one way we kind of prevent having errors happen in the bus, or we prevent reading messages that have errors. There are some other bits that go into this equation, and this is not a full picture of everything in the CAN bus, but this is just a simplification for the purpose of this presentation, so you don't get confused by the other bits that are not going to make as much sense unless you get more into detail about how the CAN bus works. So that's represented by this gray part, but I'm not going to show that anymore. So just know it's not just these 3 sections. There are other sections. There are other bits that go into this equation to make the redundancy check bits, but I'm not going to talk about it. Okay, so let's run through an example of how this works with our brake light dashboard example from earlier. One quick note about this slide is this says 1 to 8 bytes. You can actually have a CAN message with 0 bytes. That's just a mistake I made on the slide. But we never send a 0 byte CAN message as a team currently, but we could do that. That is an option. Okay, so we're going to start out with the brake light PCB. So the brake light PCB wants to send out a message for anyone to listen to that says, hey, the brake is being pressed right now. Okay. It has its address. It knows the data it wants to send. It's going to run that through some equation with the other bits, and it's going to generate the bits it wants to send as the redundancy check. And so this is just like some crazy equation that takes into account all these bits that are being sent and generates some like fairly unique set of bits that that would in theory would only be, in theory, if these like bits were different, then you get different redundancy check bits. And so it's basically, the equation is complicated and I'm not gonna go over it. And I don't really understand it, but the idea is just like it takes in what it meant to send and it says, here's another representation of what I meant to send. Okay. So then it packages those things together and it sends them. And so this is saying, here's what I want to send, or here's who I am, here's what I want to send, and here's a way you can check if the stuff I sent you had any errors. So then the message travels on the CAN bus. Maybe some bits get corrupted, maybe not. There are many different factors. I'm not going to go into them. And now the dashboard PCB was listening for that message. So now it receives that message because it needs to know if the brake's being pressed, but it has no way to get that information without the brake light PCB sending the message. So it received that information. It's received these bits, but these bits are not necessarily the same as these ones because there could have been some corruption between the sending and the receiving. So what the dashboard PCB then does is it takes all the bits that were in the message that are not the redundancy check bits, and it puts them through that same equation that the brake light PCB used, and then it figures out what it would expect the redundancy check bits to say. And so this is super cool because then you can compare what you expect you would have gotten in the redundancy bits with what you actually got and see if there was an error. Now, the point of this whole thing is that the probability of the errors happening in exactly the way that would make these two things still be equal even after errors is super low. It is possible that these two things could be equal even after errors, but the probability is super low. And so you can pretty confidently say I received the message I was supposed to receive if I rerun this like calculation after I receive the message and it equals what you said I was supposed to get. So that's the idea of redundancy check. It helps us check for errors. And then if these two things were not equal, then the dashboard PCB would just ignore the message. Yeah, so that's the gist of how the redundancy check works. All right, I'm gonna do a super quick poll for not this section, but the previous section, just to see how good people's memory is. And so I just want to talk about which one of these two signal types is more robust to external interference, differential or single-ended?
Hey, Lucky, I have a question.
Yeah.
If, for example, we're trying to turn on the brake light and the message has some error, what's the practical impact on the vehicle? Is like the car not going to work? or the message just gets sent again like a second later, or what do we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in most cases, PCBs that send a message on the CAN bus will do it at some fixed frequency. And so if they send one message that has corrupted information, then the PCB that's listening for that message will ignore that message, and then it'll listen to the next one. And that's usually happening super fast, like on the order of like 100 times a second. The reality is we don't really get this kind of error because the hardware for CAN is super robust. While it is possible, it doesn't happen very often. So, but it is a good check to have. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so everyone did a really good job. Who responded? We got 100% as a group, so that's great. And yes, the answer is differential because you're measuring the difference in voltage, and that interference gets applied to both of the wires that are part of the differential signal. All right, cool. All right, let's keep moving because we still have a lot to cover, and I'm going a little bit slower than I should be. All right, we're gonna talk about bus arbitration. So that idea of like a bunch of people screaming in a room, if everyone's yelling at the same time and I'm just trying to listen to Colin, I'm never gonna hear him. So I have to make a decision like who's more important. If Colin, Audie, and Anil are all shouting at the same time, who gets to talk, right? And I don't make that decision as a listener. Basically, each of them has a thing assigned to them, which is an address that says how important they are. And it kind of like they battle it out until the more important address wins. And I'm going to go over how that process looks. And we're going to look at it a couple different ways. I'm going to talk about it with an analogy. I'm going to kind of show how it plays out with the bits and a graph of the voltage over time. And I also have a video to show you guys that makes another analogy for it. So hopefully one of those things works for you. It's very simple, but it's hard to wrap your head around, but it's super, super cool because you can just have, so these things that say SG, I don't know why they say SG. These are like the PCBs that are connected to the CAN bus. And these are the two wires, the yellow and green, which is switched from what I did. Anyways, that's not important. And you can have like any number of these things all trying to talk at the same time. And it always works itself out with bus arbitration. And it's super, super cool. So I'm going to try and explain it as well as I can. So one of the critical things to understand with bus arbitration is that when you're sending a 0 on the CAN bus, you're driving the voltages, the difference in voltage between the wires apart. So you're creating a difference in the voltage. And when you're sending a 1, you just let it go. And because of these termination resistors, the voltage goes back to the same. And so an analogy I try to come up with is, those little like spring clamp things, these things, where like you squeeze them and then they automatically go back to closed. And so like you can take your hand and squeeze it and it opens up. This is like creating the voltage between the two. And this is when you let it go, the voltage just goes back to the same. So just to make that really clear, the PCBs are like the hand that's squeezing it apart. And that is equal to a 0 being sent. So when you see this, so you can imagine like an analogous version of the CAN bus, which is me just looking at someone squeeze and let go of this clip. And so anytime I see a gap, that's 0. And anytime I see them touching, that's a 1. Okay? And so the termination resistor is like the spring that brings it back to touching. So it brings it back to no voltage between the two wires. All right. Hopefully that helps a little bit with the idea of when they're driving it or when they're letting it go. So like the PCBs would drive it to get a 0 and they would just let it go to get a 1. And this is at the heart of bus arbitration. This is why bus arbitration works. So let's take a look at an example of bus arbitration. So let's say the air control PCB, which is a PCB that's in the accumulator. It's not important that you understand exactly what it is. And the dashboard PCB, let's say they both start talking at the exact same time, okay? They have a unique address that they are assigned. We assign that to them when we write the firmware for the PCB. And so these are not the actual addresses of these two PCBs, but they're just made up for this example, okay? So we're going to take a look at the voltage on the CAN bus over time, and we're going to take a look at what the two addresses are and what they're trying to send and what happens. So firstly, they both want to send a 0 because that's the first bit in their address, right? So they're both going to drive the voltage apart. They're both going to squeeze the clamp. So everything's good. They both start talking at the same time. They're both like, hey, I sent a 0. There's a 0 on the bus. Everything seems fine. The next one is a 0 for both of them as well. Everything's good. The next one is a 1. Okay, so what happens now? Now for this 1, they've both let the voltage go. So the termination resistors, acting like a spring, like in the clamps, have brought the voltage back down. But because they're still doing the same thing and they both let go at the same time, they both think everything's good still. Like they're like, well, it doesn't seem like anyone who's more important than me is talking yet. And so just one thing to recap is this time scale is like every bit is 1/500,000th of a second for us because our bus speed is 500 kilohertz. So like this is 1/500,000th of a second since they started talking, 2 500,000ths of a second, 3 500,000ths of a second. So this is happening super fast. Okay, let's see how this continues to play out. So they're sending some more of their bits. They get to another 1, right? So they were both driving the voltage high, the voltage difference high for 3 500,000ths of a second. And then the next 100,000th of a second, they both let go again. So everything still seems fine. Neither of them thinks someone more important than them is talking. But we're going to get to the end of this message, end of this address quickly. Not end of the message, sorry. End of the address. And one person's going to try and say 1 and one person's going to try and say 0. So let's see what happens. When we get to the end of this message, what happens is the 0 is what gets transmitted and the 1 fails to transmit because the dashboard like lets go of the clamp and the air control PCB keeps squeezing the clamp, right? So it keeps driving that voltage apart. And so now the dashboard's like, oh wait, I let go, but there's still a 0. So that means someone more important than me is talking. So I'm going to stop transmitting and the air control PCB gets to send the rest of its message. And so that's how bus arbitration works. And this is an example with 2 PCBs, but you could have hundreds trying to talk at the same time. I mean, I'm sure there's some limit. I don't know if it's hundreds. Definitely more than 2. You could have tons of PCBs trying to talk at the same time, and they'll slowly just keep dropping out one by one until the most important one is the only one who's still talking. And so there's this great quote from Audi that explains this, which is that the smallest addresses have the highest priority. And what that means is like, so this address is just a binary representation of some number. So like the air control PCB address is just the number 272. And the dashboard address is number 273. So 272 is smaller than 273. And so because that address is smaller, it has a higher priority, so it gets to keep sending. And so that's the whole concept of bus. Yeah.
We had a couple of questions in the chat. I could read them out or you could pull them up.
Why don't you read them out?
Sure.
Oh, actually, yeah, sorry, why am I saying that? I'll just pull them up. Okay. Is this address the address of the device or the address of the message being sent? So it's the address of the message that's being sent. So one device could send multiple different messages. That's a great distinction. And so, yeah, so when a device is sending a message, in the firmware, we tell it what address to use. And there's something I'll just mention at the very end of this presentation, which is called the CAN address space. That's a great question, Jack. I was going to cover that in this presentation, but I decided not to. Okay, sorry. Okay. Anyways, these are a lot of good questions. The point is that the address is specific to the message, not specific to the PCB. The PCB could send on multiple different addresses. So to answer that question, how do we determine which PCBs are high priority? I'm not going to answer that question right now because it's kind of involved, but the general idea is the more critical the information, the more important you are. And so like sensing, for example, the car is not going to stop working if we don't know the like wheel speed. Right now we only use that for just logging purposes. So wheel speed would be less important than like whether or not the brake is being pressed, which is critical for car operation, for example. Okay. Oh, sorry. Thank you for that note, Colin. Okay. So, and then lastly, for Jack's question, how is the frequency of the CAN bus set when transmitting and receiving, and how is it synchronized between PCBs? I'm not going to cover that in this presentation. And I'm happy to talk about it more later on with anyone who's interested, but yeah, I'm not going to cover that in this presentation. Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to keep moving on because I'm running a little late. I think we might skip this video because I'm running a little behind on my presentation, but you're welcome to watch it. It just gives another kind of physical representation of what's going on with the CAN bus. Nathan and I pretend to be two different PCBs, and we're lifting a pillow up and dropping it down to show like sending a 0 or a 1. So you're welcome to watch it on your own time, but I think for audio's sake, because I don't want to take too much of the time, I'm going to move on. Whoops. Okay. So we covered why is CAN so cool. It's a differential signal. It has a redundancy check to help us catch errors. Bus arbitration is super cool because you can know exactly which PCB is more important than another one, and it just kind of works itself out. And because of that, it makes it super easy to just add new PCBs to the bus whenever you want, because they can all just keep trying to talk at the same time. And as long as you give them unique addresses, they'll just figure out themselves who should be talking at the right time.
Hey, Lucky, I have a quick question about bus arbitration. How
Yes.
does each PCB know how long to wait before it sends its message again? For example, if it's like the most important PCB, it gets its message out and then it needs to wait for all the other PCBs to share their message.
So the most important one never waits. If the most important one wanted to just keep sending messages over and over and over again, it could. But yeah, so what happens is the most important one sends, and then there's like a specific set of bits that ends a CAN message, so everyone else realizes that the CAN message is ending, and then they all start trying again, and then the most important one goes. And so like, because our CAN bus usage is sparse, meaning that like we're not using all 500, like we're not using the maximum speed we have to, and like the important ones are transmitting at a slower, at rates that are not super fast, or all of them are not transmitting at rates that are super fast. In between the time that the important one tries to send again, there's enough time for everybody else to send their messages to. Is kind of the idea. Okay. So anyways, this is just a silly picture of Anil dabbing because CAN is so cool. And Peter is also in this picture. Anyways, okay, moving on. All right, I am going to kind of run pretty quickly through this part because we're running out of time. So I'm sorry about that, but this part is super simple. All we're gonna talk about is the concept of bit stuffing. So in CAN, you are not allowed to send 6 of the same bytes in a row ever. And this is about timing. I'm not gonna go over how it affects timing because you're not gonna have time, but this kind of gets to Jack's question about how is the frequency set between the two things that are sending and receiving, 2 or more things that are sending and receiving. So bit stuffing exists so that the timing works out, but I'm not going to explain how it impacts timing. I'm just going to explain what bit stuffing is. So basically, every time there are 5 of the same bits in a row.
Okay, could you minimize that chat? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I didn't realize you guys can see that. Okay. So every time you send a message, when it actually sends, if there's more than 5, like if the things, like the hardware sending the message sees 5 of the same bits in a row, it'll just add the opposite bit right after them, so that you never have more than 6. You never have 6 in a row that are the same bit. And when the message is decoded, these are just automatically removed by the same logic. So you might think like, oh, at worst case, you're going to add 1 bit for every 5 bits that you send. But it actually doesn't check to see if the next bit was already going to be different. If it sees 5, it just stuffs 1 anyways. So in the worst case, you can actually add 1 bit every 4 bits. And so I'm going to skip time. I'm not going to talk about timing, but basically that yields this magic equation, which tells you how long your CAN message is going to be in the worst case. And so can you see my little like video window? Is that blocking this? No? Okay, cool. So basically you have your data. So remember I talked about how data can be 0 to 8 bytes. So each byte is 8 bits of data. So your data bits are 8 times the number of bytes of data you want to send. There are 44 fixed bits that are going to be part of every CAN message. So you add those together. And then you add all the bits that could be stuffed, which is 34 of those 44 bits. -1 because the start bit is always a 0. Anyway, so it's not important that you 100% understand this equation. The point is you can use this equation, even if you don't fully understand it, to figure out the worst case length, which is that every 4 bits you stuff an extra bit. And so that tells you the worst case length. With that worst case length, you can multiply it by the frequency that you're sending that message to figure out how many bits per second that message is going to take. You add that up for all your messages, and that tells you how many bits per second you need. And anyways, so yeah, sorry I went kind of quickly through that. The idea is that bit stuffing makes your message longer than you think. The magic equation tells you the worst case length. You multiply that by the frequency, and you add that up for all your messages, and that gives you the total bits per second that you need for your CAN bus speed. And a reminder is that our CAN bus speed is 500 kilohertz. So it's sending 500 kilohertz. So it's sending 500,000 bits per second. So that was a long presentation with a lot of stuff. I'm pretty tired from it. We'll do a quick recap, which is where do we use CAN? All over the car, inside and outside of enclosures, primary way our PCBs communicate. Why is it cool? It's a differential signal. It has a redundancy check to check errors, and it uses bus arbitration, so you can have like any number of things and you can just add them at will. And to figure out how fast it needs to be, you use a special equation, and this part of the equation is a result of the concept of bit stuffing. Cool. If you want to learn more, there's some information here. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but you can look at this presentation later on. It's on the drive. I'll send a link to it. But yeah, that's basically everything I have to share about CAN. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully it was straightforward enough to follow. I think for right now, we probably won't do questions just because I kind of went a little bit over time, and I don't want Adi to not have enough time for his presentation, which he already does not have enough time. So I apologize about that. And yeah, if you have questions, feel free to shoot me Slack messages. I'll try to look through the chat and respond to people individually as much as possible. But yeah, thank you very much. I think we want to take a couple minutes at least to break, Adi, or do you want to just go ahead and get started?
Yeah, let's take like 3. Come back in a few minutes.
Okay.
And that'll give me time to get set up.
Sounds good.
Lucky, you should get an award for your entire sub-team being here.
Oh, that's pretty sick. Well, we just had a meeting right before this too, but that's good to hear. Oh, Adi, I'm sorry that I went so much over time.
Oh, I'm muted. It's okay. It was a good presentation, is what I was saying.
Thanks.
Okay, so I think I'm recording now. Now let me pull up the chat. Okay, yeah, and Colin dropped a link in the chat. So if you